When I started this class, I knew this would be a challenge for me. I have always considered myself a very technologically capable person, and I have spent my fair share of time playing with Arduinos, Raspberry Pis, and other electronic devices. But I was not blind to the fact that my experience with most of the topics covered in this class were still very new to me. I took this class because I wanted to learn more about electronics, and despite my final device not working, I would still consider this some form of a success. The beginning of this project went great. I had scoured the list of sensors and thought the FXOS 8700 9DOF sensor looked cool. Being able to detect both motion and magnetic fields, I thought this would work great as a small-scale security system for a bedroom. The idea was that I could use the sensor to detect when a door was opened and send an alert to my phone telling me when it had happened. I called it the door detector, and to toot my own horn, I thought it was a great name. Everything was smooth sailing. I was successfully able to get my ESP32 working properly with the movement sensor. You can see the serial monitor is giving out live values of how it's moving, and the magnetic values too. This was a great first step, and I felt like the idea was already looking very promising. The next step was to begin designing the device. Without a doubt, this was my favorite part of the whole class. I love learning new software, and I always wondered the specifics of designing your own PCB. Like, how cool is that, to make your own PCB? So we started to learn Eagle, and I really liked it. Designing the schematic and downloading our sensors and importing them, figuring out what we needed and didn't need, it was really fun, and I learned a lot about how PCBs work. It's kind of like a game, wiring things together and getting really close to making it work, only to realize there is no way that one configuration works and having to start again. This is raw trial and error, and after many hours, it eventually worked. After the PCB was done, I began working on the 3D model. This was much less of a challenge for me because I had years of experience with 3D printing, but much less with Fusion 360. I was able to design the case, which fit my board perfectly. This was a success. Next up was ordering my custom PCB. I was most excited about this step. To see something digital that I made become physical is one of the coolest things to me, but this is where problems arise. A small battery charger, the MCP73831T, was out of stock. But there was something else. The sensor I had based this entire device around was no longer in stock at JLC PCB, which is a bit of a problem. This was roadblock 1. I didn't let this stop me though. I reconfigured my board layout and prepared to manually solder on the sensor and microchip myself. If I can't get the whole thing to come in functional, at least I can still fabricate the board and finish it at home. Or so I thought. The boards came in and they looked awesome. I was super proud of myself. I started soldering the sensor and microchip to my board and everything looked great. I went to plug in the board and upload my code and kept getting an error. A fatal error occurred. Failed to connect to ESP32. Timed out waiting for packet header. I Googled like mad. Generally this is an issue with people forgetting to press the boot button down on the board, but my board literally does not have that button. I changed the board type to all different boards. I tried messing with the upload speed. I checked my wiring. Nothing worked. This was roadblock 2. It was at this point I realized that if I was going to use the board with a sensor like this, that I'd need to resize the case, so I 3D printed another case and got back to work. I didn't fret though. Despite the board not working, I knew I had another one I could use. One of the possible problems I read online mentioned the board simply might be broken, so I soldered on a new microchip and put on the sensor to the second board, and nothing. My boards don't work. This was roadblock 3. At this point, I was pretty defeated. I had been at this for a while and felt like all the work I had done in preparing the case, the board, and everything else was all for nothing. I began to stick with it and began taking my functional prototype ESP32 and sensor and began attaching it to a copperplate PCB I had. I soldered everything together, checked my connections, and plugged it in. I was able to upload the code and thought this meant things were looking up, until I saw another error. Oops, no FXOS 8700 detected. Check your wiring. This was roadblock 4. You see, somewhere along the lines, I can only assume the sensor got damaged. I desoldered everything from the copper plate and went back to the breadboard. Same error. The sensor no longer works. This is where I felt like giving up. My dad was able to scour another motion sensor we had laying around, the MPU 6050. However, a similar issue came from that, and that's what you get for buying cheap Chinese electronics. I had one last bet, and that was to go analog. We had an analog mercury switch that I figured could at least give a true false reading to see if a door had opened, but I was unable to get the code working for it. I kept getting failed to execute script ESP tool. This was roadblock 5. This is where the journey begins to end. At this point, I have nothing I can use to get this working in the way I want it to, but it's not for a lack of trying. It's pretty fascinating to see how things can all go wrong so fast, but this doesn't mean it was a failure. Sure, at that moment, I felt like an idiot. I was so sure this was going to work, and yet Murphy's Law proves me wrong. It's still hard to say exactly what went wrong. There are so many factors. Did I break the PCB when soldering on the microchip or sensor? Did I have the wrong chip by accident without realizing? Was it destined to fail from the beginning because of a failure in the PCB design? I don't know the answer to these questions. Yet, there are still many positive learning outcomes from this that deem this entire process a success. So let's talk about what the good parts are. Learning outcomes. I still learned a lot from this whole thing. I learned the basics of PCB design in EagleCAD. I learned how to properly pick sensors and read their data sheets to determine if things are correct or not. I learned more about modeling in Fusion 360. I learned how to order a PCB online, and I got plenty of practice in the problem-solving department too. Recognizing your successes, despite an obvious defeat. Recognizing success in the face of defeat is difficult. It can often feel like if the end product didn't meet the goal, then what's the point? However, while the end of this project was not a success, there were still many successes along the way. I successfully proved the prototype works. I successfully designed and ordered a PCB. I successfully 3D printed a case that fits my board twice. I successfully soldered and desoldered way more wires than I was anticipating. James Dyson failed 5,127 times when developing the first bagless vacuum. If anything, that just tells me I'm only at the beginning. Sure, it sucks that I didn't end up with what I wanted. Instead of a small box attached to a door, I sit in front of a mess of sensors and boards which feel like moderately expensive paperweights. I didn't end up with what I wanted, but I definitely learned more than I expected to. I think that's the beauty of it. That's what this class was for, and that's what I got. I learned. I got a lot out of it, and yeah, I don't know. Thanks.